Michelle Patterson's day began like any other in Somerset County's affluent Pine Grove neighborhood. The autumn breeze carried the scent of pumpkin spice from her favorite coffee shop as she navigated her silver Mercedes SUV through the winding streets of their gated community. Her children, Aiden and Zara, sat in the backseat, arguing playfully about their upcoming school science fair projects. At Somerset Academy's drop-off line, Michelle straightened Aiden's tie and kissed Zara's forehead. "Remember, Grandma Rose is picking you up today," she reminded them, watching as they joined their friends on the pristine campus. Few knew she was married to Mayor James Reynolds. They'd kept her maiden name to give their children a chance at a normal life, away from political spotlight. Back in her car, Michelle checked her phone. A reminder popped up about the afternoon gathering at City Hall, where parents planned to discuss the proposed budget cuts to art and music programs. As head of the Education Enhancement Foundation, she couldn't miss it. Her passion for education had driven her to create the foundation 5 years ago, helping underfunded schools across the county. The gathering was scheduled for 2 p.m. Michelle spent the morning at her foundation's office, reviewing grant applications and preparing her talking points. Her assistant Taylor brought in a fresh cup of mint tea. "The media will be there," Taylor mentioned cautiously. Channel 7 confirmed they're covering it. Michelle nodded, used to navigating press attention around education initiatives. "We'll stay focused on the children's needs," she replied, reviewing the latest statistics on her laptop. The numbers were concerning. Arts funding had dropped 60% in the past 3 years. At 1:45 p.m., Michelle arrived at City Hall. The stone steps were already filling with parents, teachers, and supporters. She recognized many faces from school board meetings and fundraisers. The atmosphere felt charged, but positive as she joined the crowd, her pearl necklace, a wedding gift from James, catching the afternoon sun. Nobody expected what happened next. A countergroup arrived, angry about property tax increases needed for school funding. As Michelle stepped up to speak, someone pushed forward. The crowd surged. Michelle lost her balance, reaching out to steady herself against a man who immediately shouted accusations about being attacked. Police rushed in, the situation spiraled, and before anyone could explain, Michelle found herself being handcuffed. "You don't understand," she tried to explain calmly, but her words were lost in the chaos. News cameras captured everything. The respected foundation director being led down the City Hall steps in handcuffs, her pearl necklace broken and scattered on the ground. In his mayoral office across town, James Reynolds was in a budget meeting when his assistant burst in. The flat-screen TV on the wall showed Michelle's arrest playing out live. James gripped his desk, knuckles white, maintaining his composed expression even as his world tilted on its axis. He couldn't react publicly, not yet. Years in politics had taught him timing was everything. As Michelle sat in the back of a police car, she thought of Aiden and Zara at school, of James in his office, of all they'd built together. She held on to one certainty: the truth would come out. But she never imagined the path to that truth would lead through Judge William Crawford's courtroom, or that her family's private life was about to become the center of a national storm. Judge William Crawford sat in his private chambers, the morning light filtering through century-old windows of the Essex County Courthouse. His leather chair creaked as he leaned back, scanning the front page of the New York Times. The headline about Michelle Patterson's arrest brought a thin smile to his face. His morning coffee grew cold as he read every detail, already formulating his strategy. A knock at his heavy oak door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, quickly arranging his expression into its usual stern mask. His clerk, Michael Preston, entered with a stack of files. "Your Honor, they'd just assigned the Patterson case to Judge Reynolds in room 204, Michael said, placing the day's docket on the desk. Crawford's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. He'd been waiting for this moment. "Get me Chief Justice Anderson on the phone," Crawford ordered, standing to look out over the courthouse square. The call took less than 5 minutes. 20 years of belonging to the right clubs, attending the right parties, and keeping the right secrets had its advantages. By noon, the Patterson case was reassigned to his courtroom. Crawford allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he reviewed Michelle's file. The charges seemed minor on the surface: disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, inciting a disturbance. But he knew how to make mountains out of molehills, especially with certain defendants. At the Pine Valley Country Club that evening, Crawford held court at his usual corner table. "These people need to learn respect for law and order," he proclaimed to his dinner companions, all influential figures in Essex County. "Remember that case last summer? Same attitudes, same excuses. Not in my courtroom." What Crawford didn't know was that one of the waiters, a law student working his way through school, was carefully noting every word. The young man's sister worked in Mayor Reynolds' office, though this connection remained unknown to the judge and his friends. Later that night, Crawford returned to his restored Victorian home in the historic district. His housekeeper had left dinner in the warming oven. She knew his late nights well. As he ate alone in his wood-paneled study, he reviewed his notes on Michelle Patterson's foundation. The Education Enhancement Foundation had been a thorn in his side for years, supporting programs he voted against on the county finance board. Now its director sat squarely in his crosshairs. Crawford pulled up the foundation's website on his laptop, studying Michelle's professional photo. Something about her seemed familiar, but he dismissed the thought. His phone buzzed. A text from Chief Justice Anderson. "Dinner at the club tomorrow? Need to discuss the Patterson case." Crawford typed a quick acceptance, already anticipating the conversation. Anderson never interfered with his methods, just offered subtle suggestions to maintain appearances. As midnight approached, Crawford finally closed the file. Through his study window, he watched a police car cruise slowly past his house, the usual security patrol he arranged after certain controversial verdicts. He felt untouchable in his position, secured by decades of carefully cultivated relationships and buried secrets. In his mind, the Patterson case was already decided. He'd make an example of her, send a message that would echo through every courtroom in New Jersey. Little did he know, his perfectly constructed world was about to unravel, one carefully hidden thread at a time. The marble halls of Essex County Courthouse buzzed with anticipation on the trial's opening day. Michelle Patterson sat straight back beside her attorney, Emma Richardson, her navy blue suit pristine, her expression composed. The gallery behind them filled with supporters from Somerset Academy and the Education Enhancement Foundation. Judge Crawford entered the courtroom precisely at 9 a.m., his black robes flowing as he ascended to the bench. His gavel crack echoed through the hushed chamber. Case number 2025 CR 789, State versus Michelle Patterson, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority he cultivated over 2 decades. The prosecution's opening statement painted a picture of chaos and defiance. Ms. Patterson turned a peaceful gathering into a dangerous situation, the prosecutor declared. Emma Richardson watched Crawford's face carefully, noting how he nodded almost imperceptibly at key points in the prosecution's narrative. When Emma rose to speak, Crawford's interruptions began. "Relevance, counselor?" he asked repeatedly as she tried to establish Michelle's background in education advocacy. "The court's time is valuable. Stick to the events in question." During the morning recess, Michelle stepped into the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. She overheard 2 clerks whispering. Crawford requested this case specifically, one said. Never seen him so interested in a simple disorderly conduct charge. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution called their star witness, Officer Peter Martinez, who had made the arrest. As he described Michelle as aggressive and uncooperative, she caught Crawford leaning forward, drinking in every word. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap were the only sign of her inner turmoil. In his chambers during lunch break, Crawford met with his clerk. "Make sure those character witnesses from the foundation don't make it to the stand," he instructed. "Find any reason. Scheduling conflicts, paperwork issues, whatever it takes." Across town in City Hall, Mayor James Reynolds maintained his public schedule, meeting with developers about a new shopping center. Inside, his stomach churned as his assistant slipped him hourly updates from the courthouse. Each note confirmed his worst fears about Crawford's handling of the case. The afternoon session brought the police body cam footage into evidence. The prosecution showed carefully selected clips that supported their narrative. When Emma requested to show the complete footage, Crawford deemed it redundant and time-consuming. "Your Honor," Emma protested, "the full video provides essential context." "Ms. Richardson," Crawford cut her off, his tone sharp, "my ruling stands. The jury has seen sufficient footage to understand the situation." In the gallery, Taylor from the Foundation furiously took notes, documenting every questionable ruling. She'd been assigned this task by someone in the mayor's office, though she didn't know the full reason why. As the day drew to a close, Crawford called both attorneys to the bench. "I expect this trial to conclude swiftly," he announced, his tone leaving no room for debate. "The facts are straightforward. No need for extensive witness testimony or drawn-out proceedings." Michelle walked out of the courthouse that evening into a sea of reporters. Camera flashes lit up the darkening sky as she maintained her dignified silence. At home, she hugged her children tight, helping them with homework as if everything was normal. Only later, alone in her study, did she allow herself to cry, her tears falling on a framed photo of her family at James's mayoral inauguration. That night, Crawford dined alone at his club, savoring each bite of his perfectly cooked steak. He had no idea that his every move was being watched, his every word noted, as the pieces of a plan he couldn't see moved quietly into place. The crystal chandeliers of Pine Valley Country Club cast elegant shadows across Judge Crawford's favorite corner table. His laughter rang out as he swirled an aged scotch, surrounded by the city's elite. Senator Thompson leaned in, curiosity glinting in his eyes. "Tell us, Bill, how's that Patterson case going?" Crawford dabbed his mouth with a monogrammed napkin, savoring the moment. "Let's just say she won't be organizing any more troublesome gatherings," he smirked. "These foundation types think money buys them special treatment. Not in my courtroom." Across the table, banking executive Charles Preston nodded approvingly. "Good to see someone finally taking a stand. These people move into our neighborhoods, start making demands." He trailed off as a waiter approached to refill their glasses. Unknown to them, the waiter, Marcus Torres, kept his face carefully neutral as he poured. His phone, hidden in his pocket, recorded every word. After his shift, he'd make his third late-night visit to City Hall that week. Meanwhile, Mayor James Reynolds sat in his dimly lit office, his tie loosened, jacket draped over a chair. Spreadsheets and transcripts covered his desk, each document adding another piece to the puzzle he'd been assembling for years. His assistant, Lisa Chen, entered with fresh coffee and another stack of papers. "The recordings from the club just came in," she whispered, even though they were alone. "And Judge Martinez sent over the sealed records you requested from the 2019 cases." James rubbed his temples, exhaustion etching lines around his eyes. The political tightrope he walked grew thinner each day. One wrong move, one leaked detail about his connection to Michelle, and everything would collapse before they had enough evidence. His phone buzzed. A text from Michelle. "Aiden won first place in the science fair. Wished you could have been there." His heart tightened. Their public separation during the trial felt like a physical wound, but they both understood the stakes. Back at the country club, Crawford held court with increasing animation, the scotch loosening his tongue. "You should see her face when I sustain objections," he boasted. "Always so controlled. But I'll break that facade soon enough." The club's owner, Richard Maxwell, shifted uncomfortably. He'd known Crawford for 20 years, but something felt different lately. The judge's usual calculated demeanor had taken on an edge of personal vendetta. In a quiet study room at the Somerset Public Library, Michelle's attorney, Emma Richardson, met secretly with State Supreme Court Clerk James Chen. "These records show a clear pattern," Emma whispered, sliding a folder across the table. "But we need more. Something undeniable." James nodded grimly. "Keep pushing in court. Make him show his hand. We'll handle the rest." Neither mentioned their connection to the mayor's office. In this game, deniability was everything. As midnight approached, Mayor Reynolds finally headed home, his briefcase heavy with documents. He drove past the courthouse, its limestone facade pale in the moonlight. Behind those walls, Crawford thought he was the hunter. He didn't realize he was becoming the prey. At home, James found Michelle asleep on their living room couch, case files spread around her. He gently covered her with a blanket, noticing the fresh tear stains on her cheeks. On the coffee table sat Aiden's science fair trophy, a small victory in their growing store. In his study, he added the day's new evidence to his private safe. The combination, Michelle's birthday, felt like a quiet act of defiance against those who thought they could tear his family apart. Soon, very soon, everything would change. But timing was crucial, and James Reynolds had learned to play the long game. The morning of the sentencing painted the Essex County Courthouse in shadows. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray October sky. Inside Courtroom 302, every bench was filled, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Michelle Patterson stood as Judge Crawford entered, her caramel-colored blazer, a spot of warmth in the austere room. Her children, Aiden and Zara, sat in the front row with their grandmother Rose, who clutched their hands tightly. Behind them, teachers from Somerset Academy filled 3 rows, their presence a silent testament to Michelle's character. Crawford adjusted his robes with practiced ceremony, relishing the weight of all eyes upon him. The morning sun through the high windows cast his face in harsh relief as he shuffled his papers, dragging out the moment. "Before I deliver the sentence," Crawford began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "would the defendant like to make a statement?" Michelle stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Her voice remained steady, though her hands clasped tightly at her waist. "Your Honor, I stand by my work with the Education Enhancement Foundation. Every child deserves." "That's enough," Crawford cut her off. "This court is not interested in your foundation's agenda. We are here to address your actions, which demonstrate a blatant disregard for law and order." In the back of the courtroom, national news reporters scribbled frantically. The story had captured attention across the country, though none yet knew its true significance. Near the door, Taylor from the foundation recorded every word on her tablet, her fingers trembling with barely contained anger. Crawford lifted his gavel, pausing for dramatic effect. "Michelle Patterson, this court finds your behavior particularly egregious. Your position in the community makes your actions even more reprehensible. You've used your foundation as a shield while inciting chaos in our streets." Emma Richardson shot to her feet. "Your Honor, I object to this characterization." "Overruled," Crawford snapped. "Ms. Richardson, one more outburst and you'll be held in contempt." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. 12-year-old Zara buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder, while Aiden stared straight ahead, his jaw set just like his father's. "I hereby sentence you to life in prison," Crawford declared, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "Let this serve as a message to anyone who would disturb the peace of our community." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Even the most seasoned reporters looked shocked. The sentence was wildly disproportionate to the charges. Michelle stood perfectly still, her chin lifted, eyes locked on Crawford's face. In that moment, her dignity spoke louder than any protest could. "Bailiff, take her into custody," Crawford ordered, already rising to leave, expecting this to be his crowning achievement. In City Hall, Mayor James Reynolds watched the live feed on his office TV, his knuckles white against the desk edge. Lissa Chen stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Sir," she whispered, "it's time." James nodded once, picking up his phone. Years of political strategy had taught him to wait for the perfect moment. Crawford had just handed it to him on a silver platter. As Michelle was led away, she glanced back at her children. A small, confident smile played at the corners of her mouth, the same smile she'd worn at every foundation victory, at James' election night, at moments when she knew change was coming. Outside the courthouse, protesters began gathering, their signs demanding justice. Above them, in his chambers, Crawford loosened his tie and poured himself a congratulatory drink, unaware that in less than 24 hours, his world would shatter like fine crystal dropped on marble floors. The City Hall conference room gleamed under soft recessed lighting, its mahogany table reflecting the tense faces of those gathered for the emergency budget meeting. Judge Crawford sat near the head of the table, his usual seat of privilege, while council members filtered in with folders and laptops. Mayor James Reynolds entered last, his presence commanding attention without a word. The room settled into uneasy silence as he took his place at the head of the table. Dark circles beneath his eyes hinted at sleepless nights, but his charcoal suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable. Before we discussed the budget, Crawford spoke up, unable to resist bragging about his recent triumph. I'd like to commend the council on their support of our judicial system. Yesterday's sentence sends a clear message about maintaining order in our city. Several council members shifted uncomfortably. Patricia Morgan, the senior councilwoman, glanced nervously between Crawford and the mayor. She'd known James Reynolds for 15 years and had never seen him so still, so focused. The Patterson woman, Crawford continued, warming to his subject, exemplifies a certain type who think they're above the law. These foundation directors with their fancy degrees and elite connections. What type would that be exactly, Judge Crawford? Mayor Reynolds' voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. He remained seated, one hand resting on a thick manila envelope before him. Crawford waved his hand dismissively. You know the sort, Mr. Mayor. Coming into our neighborhoods, stirring up trouble with their so-called educational initiatives. Someone had to take a stand. Please, James said softly, dangerously, elaborate on their kind. Something in his tone made Crawford pause, but his arrogance pushed him forward. Well, when they marry into money, they think they can buy their way into our circles. But in my courtroom, that would be my wife you're talking about, Your Honor. The words fell into dead silence. Crawford's face froze mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open. Around the table, several gasps broke the stillness, followed by the sound of Patricia Morgan's coffee cup clattering against its saucer. What did you say? Crawford's voice had lost its authoritative edge. James stood slowly, his movements deliberate. Michelle Patterson is my wife. We kept her maiden name to protect our children's privacy. He began laying photographs on the table, family pictures, wedding photos, images of Michelle and James at private events. But privacy matters less now than justice. Crawford's face drained of color as his eyes darted between the photos and James's face, finally recognizing the familiar features he dismissed in Michelle's file. But that's not possible. You never said. No, I didn't, James agreed, his voice level. I waited. I watched. I gathered evidence. He opened the manila envelope, spreading its contents across the table. 5 years of documented judicial misconduct. Transcripts from your country club conversations. Records of disproportionate sentencing based on race and social status. All properly notarized and copied to the state Supreme Court. The council chamber had become so quiet that the wall clock's ticking echoed like thunderclaps. Crawford's hands began to tremble as he reached for the documents. Don't bother reading them here, James said, gathering the papers back into the envelope. Your copy is being delivered to your office as we speak, along with notice of an emergency judicial review. I believe you'll find your afternoon schedule has been cleared. Crawford stumbled to his feet, his face now ashen. You planned this. No, Judge Crawford. James straightened his tie, every inch the mayor rather than the hurting husband he'd been forced to hide. You planned this with every biased ruling, every prejudiced sentence, every moment of unchecked power. I simply documented it. As Crawford staggered toward the door, James added quietly, And Judge, I believe you'll want to contact your attorney. Immediately. The morning sun cast long shadows through the blinds of Judge Crawford's chambers as he watched his empire crumble. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Calls from reporters, former friends, and increasingly worried colleagues. Each time he checked the screen, another number he recognized had been disconnected or blocked. On his desk, the morning's newspaper screamed the headline, JVG Ilvendior NVE Histigation. Mayor's wife wrongfully sentenced. 3 other papers carried similar stories, each adding new details about his past cases. His secretary had already quit, leaving a short resignation letter that spoke volumes. I need to protect my own reputation. At the Pine Valley Country Club, his permanent reservation table sat empty. The manager, who had fawned over him for 15 years, sent a polite email canceling his membership. Recent events have forced us to review our admission policies, it read. Crawford's hands shook as he deleted the message. Across town, State Supreme Court Justice Alina Martinez stepped out of her car, cameras flashing as she entered the Essex County Courthouse. We take allegations of judicial misconduct extremely seriously, she announced to the waiting reporters. Every case Judge Crawford has presided over in the past 5 years will be reviewed. Inside her office, a team of law clerks had already begun the massive task of audit. Boxes of files lined the walls, each containing lives affected by Crawford's prejudiced rulings. Young law student Marcus Torres, no longer in his waiter's uniform, pointed out patterns in the sentencing data, his detailed recordings from the country club providing context for each decision. Crawford's attorney, Philip Bennett, sat in his client's living room, surrounded by evidence from Mayor Reynolds' files. Bill, he said gravely, this isn't just about the Patterson case anymore. They have recordings, witnesses, statistical analysis. What were you thinking at that budget meeting? But Crawford barely heard him. Through his window, he watched as neighbors quickly turned away when they spotted him. The police car that once patrolled protectively now parked openly, monitoring his house. His phone buzzed again. Charles Preston from the bank, canceling their golf game indefinitely. At the state capitol, Governor Laura Chen called an emergency press conference. In light of recent events in Essex County, I am establishing a judicial oversight committee, she announced. No one is above the law, especially not those entrusted to uphold it. Michelle's case file lay open on the governor's desk, alongside a photo of her with James and their children at a charity event last spring. The contrast between the happy family and Crawford's vindictive sentencing couldn't have been starker. Back in his chambers, Crawford opened his desk drawer, removing photos from decades of power lunches and charity galas. In each one, he stood surrounded by people who now wouldn't take his calls. His hand brushed against an old newspaper clipping, his appointment to the bench. Justice must be blind, he proclaimed in his acceptance speech. A knock at his door made him jump. Lisa Chen, Mayor Reynolds' assistant, stood in the doorway. The State Bar Association's Ethics Committee requests your presence at tomorrow's emergency session, she said formally, placing a thick envelope on his desk. Your attendance is mandatory. As she turned to leave, Crawford called out, Wait, can you tell the mayor? Tell them I want to apologize. Lisa paused, her expression neutral. I believe, Your Honor, that any apologies should be directed to Mrs. Patterson Reynolds. Though I doubt she's interested in words at this point. She's more focused on actions and consequences. The door closed with a quiet click, leaving Crawford alone with the wreckage of his carefully constructed world. Outside his window, television trucks continued to arrive, their satellite dishes rising like steel sentinels against the darkening sky. The state Supreme Court's marble columns glowed golden in the morning light as Michelle Patterson Reynolds walked up the steps, her family beside her. James held her hand, while Aiden and Zara flanked them like honor guards. Reporters parted respectfully, their cameras clicking softly rather than the usual aggressive flashing. Inside the packed courtroom, Chief Justice Anderson spoke the words that would reshape the state's judicial landscape. In light of overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct, all sentences handed down by Judge William Crawford over the past 5 years are hereby vacated for review. Mrs. Patterson Reynolds, please rise. Michelle stood, her pearl necklace, a new one given to her by James, catching the light. The Chief Justice continued, This court offers its deepest apologies for the miscarriage of justice in your case. All charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. But this was more than one woman's vindication. Behind Michelle sat dozens of families whose lives had been touched by Crawford's biased rulings. Each would have their cases reviewed by an independent panel, their stories heard with fresh eyes and open minds. At his home, Crawford watched the proceedings on TV as he packed boxes. His law license had been suspended pending disbarment hearings. The grand mansion, bought with years of judicial salary, would be sold to help pay legal fees. His own day in court was coming, this time as a defendant. Back at the courthouse, Michelle stepped up to the podium for a press conference, James proudly at her side. Today marks not an ending, but a beginning, she announced, her voice strong and clear. The Education Enhancement Foundation will be partnering with the State Bar Association to create the Judicial Fairness Initiative. Cameras flashed as she revealed the program's details: a comprehensive review system for judicial decisions, mandatory bias training for court officials, and a scholarship fund for minority law students. The governor had already pledged her support, along with state funding. Later that afternoon, Michelle sat in her foundation office, surrounded by letters from well-wishers and families seeking help with their own cases. A knock at her door revealed Taylor, holding a familiar file. "The first case for review just came in," she said, smiling. "Ready to get back to work?" At home that evening, the Patterson Reynolds family gathered for their first peaceful dinner in months. Zara proudly showed off her social studies project, an essay about judicial reform inspired by her mother's experience. Aiden had started a student advocacy group at Somerset Academy, already drawing attention from colleges. James watched his family with quiet joy, remembering the long nights of gathering evidence, the painful separation during the trial, the strategic patience it took to bring truth to light. Michelle caught his eye and smiled, both thinking the same thing. Some causes were worth any sacrifice. As sunset painted their living room in warm hues, Michelle's phone buzzed with a message. The state Senate had just passed the Judicial Accountability Act, nicknamed the Patterson Bill by the press. Years of work advocating for education had taught her that change was possible. Sometimes it just came from unexpected directions. Outside their window, the city skyline sparkled against the darkening sky. In offices across town, law clerks continued reviewing old cases, their desk lamps burning late into the night. In university libraries, law students pored over the Patterson case, now required reading in ethics classes. At the State House, officials drafted new oversight policies, determined to prevent history from repeating. And in a small diner across town, Marcus Torres, the former waiter whose recordings helped expose the truth, sat studying for his law school finals, a letter of recommendation from Mayor Reynolds in his bag. His sister Lisa had helped him apply for one of the first judicial fairness scholarships. The wheels of justice had turned slowly, but they had turned. And in their turning, they had ground old prejudices to dust, making way for something new to grow in their place.